Welcome to True Crime Cases. Today, we are unveiling a shocking story on a calm night amid the busy metropolis. A covert matter involving Dubai. Between her and a devout Muslim wife, the father-in-law goes crazy, causing a chill catastrophe. The relationship that started in ultimately, the shadows of family get-togethers breaks out in a violent conflict that resulted in the death of one individual and the lives of several. Maryam's life was ruined in 20. Flawless from she was a dedicated 28-year-old outsider, Dubai-based wife and mother of two, beside her spouse. Although their house was small, at ease expressing their life's experiences, constructed together, Adil was a success. Well-known businessman in the neighborhood, constantly engaged in new ventures, traveling for job to neighboring nations. He gave Maryam and their family good care. Kids making sure they never desired much as of yet. Even with the stuff, there was an emotional gap in comfort. Expanding in their marriage fell was Maryam's spouse when she was just 20, and like many historic unions, which were set up by their early on families, the friendly friendship was based on mutual reverence and mutual obligations. But as the years went by, the affection between them started to wane. Adil, preoccupied with his company, turned into his absences are growing more and more remote, extended across several days, weeks, and even at home, he was frequently distracted by her work. Maryam took over the responsibility of managing the home, father and mother to their offspring. Even though she made an effort to keep her heart ached from her religious obligations. Sashira was a woman of profound loneliness, faith, and she had a firm belief in the duties that her religion has given her, and she committed herself to her culture, family, making certain that the house was always in order and her kids were brought up with the right values. But she was unable to disregard the void that became apparent in. She yearned for more in her heart than only. She yearned for emotional and financial stability, relationship, friendship. She would frequently sit by herself, wondering in the nights when Phil may return home, her mind wandering back to the life they shared before to employment, assumed control of all that occurred during one of these lonely times at the beginning of 2008 that she found herself pulled to assure more and more. Assure, the father-in-law, was a guy of impact in the family, is very admired not only by his family members but, additionally, by the larger community. He is still capable and smart in his early 60s, and consistently possessed a dominant presence as opposed to Fizzle, who was frequently too preoccupied to notice the small changes. Ashur listened to his wife. He knew that the distance was increasing between his kid and Maryam, but he never dealt with it personally. Ashur has consistently shown kindness to Sashira, sharing her knowledge and counsel throughout. From his perspective, family get-togethers were the perfect example of a devoted and decent wife. He appreciated how she was kind and patient, oversaw the home even while Adil was absent for extended periods of time. At first, they spoke briefly. Nothing unusual in terms of family exchanges, but as time passed, the character of their interactions started to shift. Ashur would find an excuse to talk more frequently, lingering in Maryam's presence at family gatherings. He was always be cautious not to sketch too much focus, but an implicit bond between them that they both felt, but neither of them dared to recognize. The link in early 2010 between them started to change from connected to something more. The subtle looks that were exchanged were hazardous. As dinners became longer, their discussions more, Ashur observed firsthand how Sashira's eyes brightened when he told her how she leaned a little closer as they. Sashira expressed how she felt abandoned by Fidel. Discovered solace in Ashur's presence. It was as if he had any understanding of her. He never listened to her with Adil. In a way, patience made her feel appreciated. She hadn't felt comfortable years despite his age and status. Ashur in the household was not exempt from the allure of prohibition. He was aware of Miriam's yearning, weakness, and started to control the circumstances. He assured her that their exchanges were innocuous, only discussions between an in-law's father and his daughter-in-law. But they both knew in their hearts, because what was taking place was not at all innocent. Their meetings turned into additional. The reclusive Ashur would look for excuses to visit Fal's house after getting to know Faisal. They would meet in the silence far away, behind locked doors in the corners of the home, always cautious to avoid being seen by the kids or any relatives. The times they spent together were full with strain that every interaction leaves Miriam conflicted between her sense of remorse and the strong feeling she had for every time she made a self-promise to would be the final, but tempting, become very powerful with each secret. Meeting Miriam's face changed the course of events. Even more complicated, she was aware that what she was doing was incorrect, a betrayal of what she owned, been instructed to value, but the sense of isolation she experienced, the bond between her and Ashur, overwhelmed her religious convictions that kept her up at night, asking for strength in prayer, forgiveness. Yet the temptation cycle persisted throughout the months. Their interactions become increasingly careless. They started gathering in quieter, riskier places, parks after nightfall, or the empty spaces of the family estate. They persuaded themselves they kept their secret concealed so that nobody could never know, but in reality, they had, becoming oblivious to the warning indications that Miriam's behavior was evolving. Despite her efforts to maintain the look of a loving mother and wife, the stress of leading two separate lives was growing too. Although frequently absent, a lot of Adil started to observe. Sashira was more reclusive throughout the change. Talks with him become terse and he choked it cold due to the strain of running the home, but a persistent. He started to mistrust himself, observing her more intently and sensing that there was something that was amiss, although he was unable to pinpoint exactly what it. By the end of 2011, there were murmurs in the family began to. The younger sister of Surface Pill had observed Ashur and Miriam interactions, looks at family get-togethers. She told Adil about it, and he fired her. Worries at first, but the doubt seed had been. As the year came to an end, the plans, Sashira and Adil's tension reached. At the height of it, he started to suspect that there was more happening in the background, but he was unable to face it head-on. At least not by the beginning of 2012. The circumstances had become into. Sashira was torn between her and the intolerable. She discovered herself feeling guilty and emotional, descending farther into a web of every contact with air seems false, such as walking a tight RPP with the knowledge that one mistake might result in catastrophe. But she was unaware of a catastrophe was already underway, and shortly, everything would fall apart in the most. Sadly, the romance was previously kept a secret, shared by two individuals, has now turned into an impending ticking time bomb. By summer 2012, the weight had exploded of the incident had started to have an adverse effect on. Sashira discovered that she was developing, growing more and more separated from her hubby. What began as guilt evolved into, she found it difficult to look him in the eyes, being aware that each time spent with him was presently occupied by, even though it's frequently missing, deception. Very minute changes in her conduct. Miriam used to be very focused, actively participating in their discussions, currently appeared to be preoccupied with her thoughts. Always, the affection she once showed him somewhere. Despite his extended vacations, he had gradually. Phil's doubts started to fade, expand, although first he attempted to ignore them following their lengthy marriage. More than 10 years, and he had consistently trusted Sashira entirely, yet it was impossible to overlook the manner in which she had becoming more reclusive in her company and The house is currently only routine. She stopped sharing the minor information about her day spent with him, no longer eagerly awaited his coming home from his work travels, but instead she appeared distracted from important discussions, frequently shifting to their bedroom early while pretending to be exhausted. At first, Phil ascribed this to the strain of running the home and mostly relying on their two kids too. He assured himself that his was hers. Perhaps the frequent job excursions had caused tension. Their relationship, and perhaps Miriam just required further assistance, but as the weeks passed, he was unable to get rid of the sensation that anything more profound was incorrect. Ashur, however, had become more audacious in his dealings with Sashira. The concealment that once their affair had been replaced by a careless bravery. He discovered other chances to remain alone yourself as she takes advantage of any Buifasol was. Family get-togethers grew stressful for Sashira, navigating the constantly expanding. She was weaving Ashur a web of lies, yet seemed unconcerned and empowered by the conviction that no one would ever. By the end of 2012, Miriam's suspicion. It was now impossible to ignore Faisal and be very aware of the. He noticed changes in his wife and started to watch her. He observed very intently how she steered clear of physical interaction with him about her. During family time, laughter looked forced. How she stopped looking at him throughout meals. While they spoke, the eye. Sometimes, the Adil would discover Sashira was deep in contemplation, gazing out of the window as though she was far away, cut off from the life they. Speculations started to circulate in late 2013 after stir among the youngest members of the family. Faiza, a sister who was always close, have long felt that something was between Miriam and Ashur was amiss. One evening over a family meal, she heard a private discussion between. The words weren't the only thing that she was drawn in, but the tone, the manner in which Ashur addressed Miriam, replied with the same gentleness that Faiza possessed. Never saw before. It made me shiver. Her spine, even if she lacked concrete proof that Faiza was aware of a problem. Later that night, she came up to Phil, communicating her initial worries. Adil brushed her off. Concerns that don't want to accept that anything unsuitable might be occurring between his spouse and his father. But what Faiza said stuck in him. Over the following few weeks, he started to pay closer attention, noting how Sashira and Ashur often appeared to vanish while family is around. Little, seem harmless occurrences that he felt electrified now after having previously ignored, with conceal, indicating that by February 2014, the suspicions were now too much to ignore. He started silently keeping an eye on Miriam, motions observing her intently without revealing that he was conscious. He saw that she would frequently depart the home while pretending to completing errands. Way her phone appeared to be closer to, more cautious than. Prior to then, there were times when he would listen to her talk softly on the phone, suddenly cutting off the discussion when he entered the room. Phil experienced a profound feeling of treachery developing inside of him, yet he kept quiet, knowing that he was wasting his time, that he was unable to face her without evidence, that his heart got heavier with every alternating day divided between his affection, consistently supported his spouse, and the expanding assurance that she was maintaining a dark, keep the emotional distance hidden from him. Between them had turned into unpleasant, but he waited with hope. Against the expectation that he was incorrect, it was mid-February that Adil eventually discovered the truth. One night, when Miriam wasn't there, he looked through her phone and discovered, broke him with words sent back and forth between. Once hidden away, Miriam and Ashur were now lying in front of him. The words were, unquestionably, there was no space for uncertainty. His father and wife had been engaging in a covert relationship. The knowledge came to him like a shock after years of drowning him in a sea of tidal waves. Rage, desperation. Phil sat silently, bearing the burden of. With his discovery weighing heavily on him, he felt as if everything had changed. Under his feet, as if they were all, had been aware that his life had been a fabrication. However, despite his anger, he avoided confronting Sashira. He waited right away, seething in his rage, letting the reality hit in. Inside of him, he would face them. However, he would do it alone. Describes the emotional bond that once kept his marriage together was now replaced by a dark, rotting anger. Phil was aware that you would never be the same once more, but he said nothing. He was awaiting the day when he could release the entire force of his rage on what had been for both Mariam and Ashur. A tranquil house has turned into a ticking clock. Bomb, and it would happen eventually. Prior to everything, what would Phil do with this if it exploded? Being aware of the dramatic swing of events would reveal the strain inside of him next. Expanded, uncomfortable, his mind dominated by his life had been destroyed by betrayal. The emotional connections he has with his once a powerful parent, he had now become raging hostility, yet his affection for his spouse had been swapped over for bitterness. The only thing left was awaiting the calm before the storm. On March 6, 2014, in the evening, Adil and Mariam house was quiet, disrupted by anything that would alter the trajectory of their life. Always coming back surprisingly early, arrived from a business trip and entered the house just after. At sunset, the inside air seemed heavy with stress, but he was accustomed to it. Sensing his doubts in recent months, brewing was usually by his side now, preventing him from ever feeling comfortable in his personal. He sat down with his briefcase at home, observed him. The kids were remaining at his house in quiet, spending the night at his sister's place, but the home wasn't completely deserted, so he might hear voices that have been muffled coming from a guest room is typically used for his dad whilst trips. The visitor's heart started racing. Uncertainties that had dogged him for a long time, he moved, now boiling to the surface. Quietly walking to the door and listening to the quiet murmurs made his thoughts more clear. Rushed with opportunities, yet in the backup, he was well aware of what he was about to find out. As he arrived at the door, it was a little. He looked into his breath with his mouth open. His throat tightened as the sight appeared in front of him. His wife Mariam, Ashur, and his father trapped in a private. For a moment, embrace time appeared to stop. The suspicions are Phil's biggest worries at the time. It had weakened him over several months. Were verified in the most catastrophic manner, in which the betrayal of not only his own father, but his wife broke through. Like before his thoughts, knife Phil's body responded. Potentially capture a surge of unmanageable anger overcame him, and he exploded. Facing them through the door, once cool and collected, the voice was now overwhelmed with rage at seeing Ashur. The father who reared him was intertwined with his. Marriage was too much for him to handle. The mind turned into a haze as ideas took over. Of treachery, shame, Mariam flinched back in surprise. Pallid face as she attempted to clarify, but the storm drowned out anything she had to say. Phil's ire at the altercation swiftly. The world of escalating Phil had collapsed down, with no way to regulate the anger that had gripped him. Emotions that had been suppressed have finally been released. With a surge of aggression, he grabbed for the ornamental knife. Is the closest thing. It was affixed on the wall for years ago. Its existence was a sign of family history. Is currently a tool of destruction without a single thought. Stabbed him with a mirror as he rushed. Every time the knife was plunged, it was motivated by the anguish of treachery. Each hit a release button for the peaked rage that had been constructing for a long time. Ashur, once a powerful and authoritative character, the family fell to the ground underneath. Blood was the power of his son's onslaught. Swiftly dragged about him, discoloring the carpet. Once alive underneath his body, now power was dead at his son's feet. The room used to be a family gathering spot. Events had turned into the setting for vicious. Sashira, frozen in disbelief at the crime, could only observe her cry as her entire world collapsed. Filled the house with echoes, yet Otto hardly heard it because he was preoccupied with. Given the magnitude of his actions, he turned to face her, his rage still raging. However, prior to acting, the weight of his body was overpowered by his axe. Worn down by the bloodshed and he collapsed due to the feelings he was experiencing. To floor, the knife fell out of his grasp, clattering on the ground covered in blood. The aftermath was a haze next to him. Hearing the disturbance, the neighbor, unaware of the catastrophe, they phoned the police. Unfolding, the police showed up inside. Minutes, their lights blazing, creating an unearthly radiance over the peaceful street. They carefully went into the home, uncertain of what to anticipate. That they discovered full on his father's blood was on the floor. Asher's expression is emotionless and lifeless. Sashira remained in the body that lay next to him. Shock remained still in the corner of the. On March 8th, the room was taken into custody. The murder's news caused anxiety. Before, the communal huddle was a respected. Now, the family guy and businessman was the topic of controversy. Whispers that his father was murdered. The talk of the town was furious. But the actual controversy was in the information about the affair that had resulted in. It as Fell waited in his cell for the Sashira. The investigation's next steps was forced to deal with the fallout from her personal behavior was questioned by the authorities' involvement in the incident at this time, visible to everyone throughout the weeks that observed the course of the inquiry and arduous information that the police put together, the circumstances that preceded the murder, questioning neighbors and family and co-workers. By March 20th, the proof opposed to Uttle was overpowering, and he was formally accused of killing his father. The consequences of his behavior weighed down on him, yet his rage had not completely diminished in his opinion where the real fault was. Alongside Miriam, the individuals that had deceived Ashurin, the closest method. As the matter proceeded to trial, though, the courtroom became into a battlefield of feelings. The specifics of the relationship were displayed for everyone to see, startling the community and damaging the family's reputation. Once esteemed, repute, despite having committed murder, appeared to be a guy who had been forced to. His breaking referred to his requests for forgiveness under. The court heard arguments about Sharia law, acknowledging the mental suffering that had motivated him to carry out the offense demonstrated to him. Fortunately, his sentence was lowered to 15 years in jail as a penalty that demonstrated the seriousness of the offense as well as and the awareness of the suffering that had brought about it. But Miriam's destiny was much additional. Harsh in the court's view, she was the actual reason behind the disaster. Her involvement in the liaison, treachery of her spouse, as well as family was considered to be the foundation of the violence that had taken place. Originally given a death sentence for a component of Samra's life scandal was saved solely because of Phil's request for mercy, despite having every cause to be hateful. His inability to bring himself to, the court decided to sentence her to death. His plea lowered her punishment to 10 years. Years after, despite this gesture of kindness, the union was irrevocably destroyed. The connection they previously had, as delicate as it was before, it was now destroyed. Miriam's reputation entirely, once that of a devoted mother and wife, was eternal. Damaged the once supportive community. The family has now abandoned her, considering her to be the driving force behind the disaster that had ruined more than one life, but a whole family, which was once a cornerstone of the. After Asher's death, the village was left in ruins. They were ripped apart by the murder and the affair, disintegrated, leaving wounds that would never heal. Otto, while avoiding death, penalty would spend his entire life in prison. With the consequences of his behavior looming, Sushira would also bear the burden over him. Burden of her decisions, sequestered from the world, her kids, and her own life, had previously known, ultimately understood the tale of their lives turned into a warning and cautionary story of the damaging force of treachery, yearning, and unbridled anger at what was once a family tie. Tradition and respect had become meaningless. Beyond just a shattered memory, restored the catastrophe that had occurred on March 6th evening, 2014 would continue to haunt them. There, by the end of 2015, Maryam had a few days left to consider the decisions that resulted in the devastation of her. The burden of her shame on her family is rivaled only by the seclusion she now faces as her spouse and father-in-law are gone. The marriage, when a connection was made in today, tradition, is only a memory broken by treachery. What will happen to the bloodshed? Will Maryam ever be able to find atonement in the community's eyes, or is she permanently tarnished by her previous transgressions? Similar to the situation in which the Muslim wife's hidden relationship with the cousin of her husband concluded in. This murder case was characterized by embarrassment, and please remember to like our videos.